apostasy, or not really an apostasy because they've never been in the truth, so they can't be an apostasy. But the people that just don't know the truth. But we're going to find out that this is not so, because Satan went to make war with the remnant of the seed which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So his need is to have false apostles and false ministers on the inside of God's church. Are you with me, brothers and sisters? Now remember, in our introduction DVD, we talked about the fact that Satan has sowed tares in God's church. We want to look in this series at these tares in this particular DVD. Let's go back to the screen now. Here we see the prophet says, while Christ is sowing the good seed, Satan is sowing the tares. There are two opposing influences continually exerted on the members of the church. One influence is working for the purification of the church, and the other for the corrupting of the people of God. So here we see there are two opposing influences in the church. One is working for the purification of the church, and the other is working for the corruption of the church. Now let me ask you a question now. Let's study. Who could be in a better position to corrupt the church? I'm not going to answer that question. We're going to let the Bible and Spirit of prophecy answer that question. But I want you to think on it. Who would be in the best position to corrupt God's church? And remember, she says there's two opposing influences. And we know these two opposing influences. One is the wheat and the other is the tare. Let's go back to the screen again now. She says, it is not by force that Satan takes possession of the human mind. While men sleep, the enemy sows tares in the church. While men are spiritually sleeping, the enemy accomplishes his work of iniquity. So here we see that while men are asleep, the enemy sows tares into the church. Now let's go to testimonies to ministers, and let's look at page 128. Remember, there are two opposing influences in the church. Testimonies to ministers, page 128, we read, the test of discipleship is not brought to bear as closely as it should be upon those who present themselves for baptism. It should be understood whether those who profess to be converted are simply taking the name of Seventh-day Adventists, or whether they are taking their stand on the Lord's side to come out from the world and be separate and touch not the unclean thing. When they give evidence that they fully understand their position, they are to be accepted. But when they show that they are following the customs and fashions and sentiments of the world, they are to be faithfully dealt with. I want you to understand here. Let me read it again. The test of discipleship is not brought to bear as closely as it should be upon those who present themselves for baptism. In other words, when someone presents themselves for baptism, brothers and sisters, we should not lower the standards in order to baptize them. That should not be. Look, God is not into numbers. Gideon tells us he's not into numbers. Deuteronomy says God did not choose us because we were the most. He chose us because we were the fewest. So the test of discipleship should be brought to bear upon everyone that presents himself for baptism. Let's continue. Testimonies, volume 5 now. Testimonies, volume 5, page 172. We read, the accession of members who have not been renewed in heart and transformed in life is a source of weakness to the church. This fact is often ignored. Some ministers and churches are so desirous of securing an increase in numbers that they do not bear faithful testimony against unchristian habits and practices. Those who accept the truth are not taught that they cannot safely be worldlings in conduct while they are Christians in name. Heretofore they were Satan's subjects, henceforth they are to be subjects of Christ. The life must testify to their change of leaders. Did you get that, saints? Ministers and churches are so desirous of an increase in numbers that they do not bear a straight testimony for those who are desiring to become members. Let's continue, saints. Let's read one more. We're reading now from Great Controversy. And we could read a lot of statements from the Bible and the Spirit of prophecy concerning this, but we just want to get this foundation. The great deceiver, she says, has many agents ready to present any and every kind of error to ensnare souls. Heresies prepare to suit the various tastes and capacities of those whom he would run. It is his plan. It is his plan to bring into the church insincere, unregenerate elements that will encourage doubt and unbelief and hinder all who desire to see the work of God advance and to advance with it. Many who have no real faith in God or in his word are sent to some principles of truth and pass as Christians, and thus they are enabled to introduce their errors as scriptural authority. Brothers and sisters, do you understand? Satan has planted tares in the church. He has brought in those. And she says it is his plan to bring into the church insincere, unregenerate elements that will encourage doubt and unbelief and hinder all who desire to see the work of God advance and to advance with it. So here we see that Satan's main game plan is to bring the tares into the church. And he has us lowering the standards to get them in. The test of discipleship is not brought to bear upon us, and those that present themselves for baptism. He is bringing in those that are trying to corrupt the people. But I want you to think, what would be his most effective place to do this? I mean, how exactly would he go about doing this? Let's go to the screen again. She says here, the tares represent a class who are the fruit, our embodiment, our error, of false principles. The Savior does not point forward to a time when all the tares become wheat. She goes on to say, then the tares are to be gathered out of the field, but they are not to be transformed by a mighty miracle into wheat. They are to remain tares and are to be cast into the fire and utterly destroyed. Brothers and sisters, here we see now. The tares are represented as a class who are the fruit, our embodiment, our error. So we see that the tare saints are opposed to the truth. And we see the Savior does not point forward to a time when all the tares become wheat. So there's never going to be a time when all the tares become wheat. Now, what this tells us? This tells us that some tares can be transformed. And the reason being, saints, a lot of tares are tares by default. Default is a word I've learned in messing around with computers because there are things called default settings. So some people that are brought into the church are sincere in mind, but the method and ways in which they're brought in, they're never actually taught the truth. So they come in and they are tares by default. If they were taught the truth, then they would have been wheat. And so these people can be transformed. But there are others that are tares through and through. Satan has actually brought them into the church, brothers and sisters. Now, this is critical. Now, as I was saying, Satan has so aligned himself with these tares and put them in a position so that when you begin to expose Satan, you expose the tares along with him. And Satan has done this in such a way that when you begin to point out the errors and what have you, the apostasies, it makes it appear that you are attacking God's church. Brothers and sisters, nothing could be further from the truth. I want to make sure you understand that these DVDs are not designed to attack the church, nor are they designed to try to get you to leave the church. Contrary to that, brothers and sisters, these DVDs are designed that you need to stay in the church because the work to be done now is in the church and not outside the church. You cannot do the work that needs to be done that God is requiring us to do now on the outside of the church. You need to be on the inside of the church. Let's back that up. Let's go now to Matthew. We're going to Matthew, the 9th chapter, Matthew 9. We need to look at this, saints. This is critical. We need to understand where we are, where we're going, what we should do, and how to do it. And I cannot overemphasize the criticalness of the times in which we live. Now, we know that Jesus came on the scene in 27 A.D. He was crucified in 31 A.D. His ministry lasted for 7 years. So for 3.5 years, the prophet brings out that Jesus was ministering, and then the next 3.5 years, the disciples was ministering. And these 7 years, 3.5 years by Jesus and 3.5 years by disciples, were especially to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. When Jesus came, there was only 7 years of probation left on the Jewish nation. They had to do whatever they do. You remember over in